Hiei shone its searchlight at 2350 to find that Nagara was no longer 2,000 meters ahead, as it had been. The 36-knot cruiser had advanced some 5,000 meters ahead of its position and veered to port in front of destroyer Yukikaze, which was preceding my ship by 2,000 meters. When Hiei's light spotted cruiser Atlanta, an estimated 5,000 meters away, the latter responded instantly with a full salvo of 5-inch guns. Hastily aimed, all 12 shells fell some 2,000 meters short of Hiei. 30 seconds later, Hiei, swinging to port, opened with its 8 14-inch guns. A range of 5,000 meters is almost point-blank for guns of this size. Almost all the 1-ton shells hit Atlanta. Rear Admiral Norman Scott and practically all other officers on the bridge were killed in an instant. Thus Abe's opening salvo avenged his friend Goto. It was one of the most accurate ship-to-ship bombardments of the entire Pacific War. Hiei paid a high price for her use of the searchlight. 4 American destroyers in front of Atlanta concentrated their fire on Hiei at distances ranging from a few hundred to 2,000 yards. Lead ship Cushing poured several main battery salvos and torrents of machine gun fire onto Hiei's bridge. Badly aimed, however, these shells and tracers cascaded down around my Amatsukaze. The spectacle was so dazzling that for many moments I stood blinded on the bridge. Fortunately, no hits were scored on my ship. Cushing is reported to have released 6 torpedoes at Hiei. None hit. If they overran, none of my crewmen saw them. I am thus inclined to doubt the claim. Cushing's shells and tracers, however, kept crossing over Hiei and showering down around Amatsukaze, seeming to pin us down. Ahead to port was the black coastline of Florida Island with its many reefs. I shouted, "Gain speed! Let's get the hell out of here to starboard!" The ship responded quickly. It broke away from Hiei and, followed by destroyer Yukikaze, raced past to starboard of Nagara. I saw numerous American ships moving like wraiths in the darkness along the coast of Guadalcanal to the right. "Turn full right, flank speed." I decided to tackle the enemy ships and deal them a blow before they got in position to hit. Our confined formation. The next moment, the wraith-like images disappeared into the black coastline. Momentarily blinded by the shells and tracers, I blinked and stared frantically until tears came to my eyes. I gazed intently ahead. 3 Japanese destroyers suddenly appeared from Hiei's right flank, preventing me from shooting at the enemy. Despairing of offensive action at the moment, I looked at Hiei. Her rugged mast was in flames. American destroyer Laffey must have scored some hits. I cursed that misfortune and then noticed that the 3 friendly destroyers had started a swerve to port, obviously trying to cover Hiei from the rear. The 3 ships, Akatsuki, Inazuma and Ikazuchi, were newer ships and faster than mine. I planned to follow behind their column. All of a sudden, a couple of flares lit up ahead. Later, I learned from Admiral Kimura that Nagara had fired them. 5 or 6 enemy ships in a column emerged clearly. The nearest was 5,000 meters, 30 degrees on my starboard bow, approaching on a roughly parallel course. I gulped. My heart bubbled with excitement. This was the chance to prove my torpedo theory. Though adopted as doctrine by the Imperial Navy, it had remained unproved. This was my chance. Lieutenant Masatoshi Miyoshi, my torpedo officer, yelled impatiently, "Commander, let's fire the fish." I answered, "Get ready, fisherman," and barked instructions. The target 30 degrees to starboard is approaching. Adjusted firing angle, 15 degrees. Navigators, turn right, close in, and follow a hyperbola. The crew responded instantly. The distance closed steadily as the adversaries approached at a combined speed of 60 knots. Miyoshi glared at me eagerly, impatiently, but I ignored him. The enemy strangely failed to open fire. Even if they did, they could not catch me in the hyperbola run, though we were separated by only 3,000 meters. "Ready torpedoes, fire!" I yelled. 8 big fish jumped in rapid succession and sped on their way. I watched prayerfully. It was 2354. Gusts of wind buffeted us on the bridge, and we were showered by spray kicked up by the dashing ship. As we turned left again, slackening speed, another couple of flares filled the sky, limning a column of 4 enemy destroyers, a distance of only a few hundred yards between each. Udachi, guns blazing, had cut in front of the American column, almost grazing the bows of Aaron Ward, which made a violent turn to avoid it. The second ship, Barton, stopped short to avoid collision with Aaron Ward. At that moment, 2 minutes after the launching of my torpedoes, 2 pillars of fire shot high in the air from Barton. These fireworks subsided so quickly that I rubbed my eyes in disbelief. The ship, broken in 2, sank instantly. I heaved a deep sigh. It was a spectacular kill, and there was a roaring ovation from my crew, but I didn't hear it. It was all too easy. My own feeling was one of satisfaction rather than exultation. It was the first real wartist of my theory, which was now a proved formula. The flares burned down and out. In the renewed darkness, a Matsukaze looped out of her firing hyperbola and headed back to the west, while I determined what to do. In the distance, I could see Hiei, barely silhouetted by its own fires. We headed in her direction. A few minutes later, we saw dim, intermittent flashes to port. Flashes outlined a sleek ship, with 4 masts, definitely enemy, possibly a cruiser. "Torpedoes, ready!" I ordered. "Target 70 degrees to port." "Torpedoes ready, sir," Lieutenant Miyoshi called back like a student answering his professor, with no trace of his earlier impatience. "All right, hold it, hold it, hold it. The target is moving ahead. Easy, easy. Easier target than the last. Miyoshi, use only 4 torpedoes this time, not 8. Steady, steady. Fire." In Hushid Silence, the 4 deadly fish left at 23:59. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, a large reddish flame rose from our target. It was American cruiser Juno that had been exchanging gunfire with Udachi. My crewmen roared with joy. Lieutenant Shimizu, the gunnery officer, wanted to bombard the target and finish it off. I said, "No, Shimizu, let's leave the spoil for our friend Udachi. Don't be impatient. We'll have plenty of targets. Shelling at this stage would only expose our position to the enemy." Amatsukaze went straight ahead. Meanwhile, savage fights were going on in other places. Commander Hideo Sekino of Hiei later recounted to me how the flagship fought. Destroyer Cushing, after its attack on Hiei, was caught by fire from destroyer Terutsuki. The Japanese ship had advanced from its position on Hiei's port quarter, and once Cushing fell under the scrutiny of Japanese searchlights, it was finished off by a point-blank salvo from Terutsuki. The second American destroyer, Laffey, almost collided with Hiei. While skidding away from a close shave, Laffey let loose a torrent of machine gun fire at Hiei's mast, riddling the bridge. Captain Suzuki was killed instantly. Others, including Admiral Abe, were wounded. Hiei's big guns and Terutsuki's torpedoes caught Laffey going away. The destroyer was hit mercilessly and sunk within a few minutes. Destroyer Sterret, next in line, fired torpedoes at Hiei. All missed. O'Bannon, following, shelled the battleship and scored many hits. Hiei's internal communications went dead at this time, and the Japanese flagship started to withdraw from action. This was just about midnight, and the fighting became terribly confused. A free-for-all followed. Destroyer Akatsuki, from her original position 2,000 meters to starboard of Hiei, had dashed forward and fired torpedoes which hit cruiser Atlanta. Akatsuki thus became caught in fatal crossfire between San Francisco and an American destroyer and was sunk with almost her entire crew. San Francisco was still battering Akatsuki when battleship Kirishima approached and finished off flagship San Francisco with deadly blows from its powerful 14-inch guns. Kirishima then left the area quickly in compliance with Abe's orders. Commander Kikawa, skipper of Udachi, narrated the night's activities of his destroyer. When we returned and crossed the American column, I saw an enemy destroyer on the port beam coming directly at me. There was no time to aim torpedoes. While exchanging gunfire, I swung hard right to rattle the enemy's aim and timing. After running for a few minutes, I saw cruiser Juno to starboard on a parallel course. Udachi fired 8 torpedoes at her, but all missed. The cruiser answered with a powerful salvo, to which I could respond only with guns. That was bad. I felt I was pinned at last. A destroyer cannot outgun a cruiser. Then all of a sudden a burst of flames rose from the cruiser. It stopped firing, spread smoke screens, and quit the fight. It was Yora Matsukaze that saved me. When Akatsuki was sunk, the 2 Japanese destroyers next behind her vengefully attacked San Francisco and Portland. The latter responded with gunfire on Inazuma and Ikazuchi. At the same time, unpredictable Udachi was closing Portland on the port quarter. Kikawa said, "I just repeated your tactics, Hara, and released 8 torpedoes at the cruiser, which was occupied with fighting in the other direction. The ship burst into flames when our torpedoes hit. Our jubilation was cut short when shells showered down on us. I was a victim of the same tactics we had just used, and now we were being bashed by someone off our stern. This must have been American destroyer Aaron Ward, which had been putting up a determined battle since Udachi had crossed its path some 10 minutes earlier. About that same time, my Matsukaze was moving northwest toward the crippled flagship. The scene was strangely quiet. Dim, distant gunfire appeared like fireworks. It was impossible to tell who was fighting. I had decided to join Hiei, which, with its deck fires, was the only ship that could be recognized. I asked if there were any important messages. A radio man replied, "No, sir, but we are not reading Hiei. Her communications must be out." Glumly, I looked at my watch. It was 13 minutes past midnight. A red flash far to the west proved to be another ship set afire. That was Udachi. I screamed as a big ship suddenly appeared out of the darkness just in front of us. Lieutenant Kinjuro Matsumoto spun the helm frantically to the right. There was nothing that the rest of us on the bridge could do but watch helplessly as the ships drew swiftly closer. Just as a collision seemed inevitable, a Matsukaze responded to her rudder, and we avoided a collision. I wondered what ship it could be. We passed so close I could not see its whole shape. There was no apparent activity on board. It had no turrets, but it was not a merchant ship. It was familiar, and yet I couldn't place it. This disturbed me, as I knew every kind of ship and decided that this must be Jingei. She was a submarine tender and had no turrets. But what was she doing here? The next moment I realized it could not be Jingei and knew this must be an enemy ship. I jumped up and yelled, "Gunners! Torpedo men! Stand ready to port!" Lieutenants Miyoshi and Shimizu shouted their readiness, but at the crucial moment I wavered again. We must identify the ship for sure and not fire at a friend under any circumstances. In desperation, I ordered searchlights. Our target appeared unmistakably to be an enemy cruiser. I ordered open fire with everything we had. 4 torpedoes leapt out. They were the last of our full load of 16. All 6 of our 4-inch guns roared for the first time in this battle. Enthusiastic gun crews fired rapid salvos. Almost every shell hit the target in this point-blank bombardment. Explosions were so near that the blasts were shaking me. Fires shot up at scores of places. Yet the enemy seemed so taken by surprise that there was no counterattack. Some 20 seconds after we opened the attack, 4 solid underwater sounds were detected. I held my breath, anticipating mighty explosions. 10 seconds passed, but there was no detonation. As the ship wobbled on, I realized my stupid mistake. Every Japanese torpedo had a safety device which prevented detonation under any circumstance within 500 meters of its launching, and our target was no more than 500 meters away. I cursed my stupidity. Through haste, I had lost the chance to make a certain sinking. One blunder usually follows another, and it did here. Wild with anger at myself, I forgot to order the searchlight to be turned off. Kikawa had reminded me that a searchlight always attracts enemy eyes, and I had forgotten the lesson. The enemy ship swerved to the left, perhaps to avoid collision, but its movements were erratic. Meanwhile, my gun crews continued firing as though shell-drunk. Every shot was hitting home. The phantom ship wobbled on, spewing fire and smoke throughout its length. This was San Francisco, and our near collision must have occurred just after Admiral Callahan and his staff, as well as the cruiser's own staff, had been wiped out by other Japanese ships. The turrets, whose absence puzzled me, had been blown to bits by direct hits from Kirishima's 14-inch guns. All of a sudden shells were failing around my ship. I thought that the phantom ship had revived and was offering a last-ditch fight. Some shells hit a Matsukaze. "Gunners, don't budge an inch," I roared. "Finish it off." Evidently I was shell-drunk too. Our guns continued to pump shells into the enemy ship, my third blunder. Actually, there were no shells coming from the dying San Francisco. A shrieking voice came through the deafening roar of guns. Warrant Officer Shigeru Iwata was shouting at me from his observation post just above the bridge. "Commander, another cruiser is sniping at us from 70 degrees to port." My head snapped to that direction, and there was another enemy cruiser. I stood frozen from head to toe, but finally yelled, "Douse searchlight, stop shelling, spread smoke screen." I had not finished the order when the third salvo from the new enemy, later identified as Helena, reached a Matsukaze. 2 shells landed very near. I hunched my back and clung to the railing. The blast was so strong it almost threw me off the bridge. The detonations were deafening. I got sluggishly to my feet, but my mind was a complete blank for several seconds. Next, I felt over my body but found no wounds. Looking around, I saw with relief that all my nearby fellow officers were alive. What about others? I saw Iwata prostrate, hanging over the range-finding gear. "Iwata! Iwata!" I cried. "What's the matter with you?" He did not move. Blood covered his head. A piece of shrapnel had pierced his skull, killing him instantly. A shell had exploded at the fire director station immediately above Iwata's observation post. "Shimizu! Shimizu!" I called at his voice tube. "How are you?" No reply came through. "Radio men, report!" I shouted into another tube. This tube was also dead silent. A second shell had pierced the deck slightly below the bridge and exploded in the radio room, killing everyone in it. The ship was still turning sharply to the right and was now starting into a loop. "Matsumoto, turn the helm!" I shouted. "I did turn, sir, but there is no response." Flames rose from under the bridge, apparently from the radio room. More fires flared. Helena had really done a job on us. "Damn it! Let's return fire!" A gunner struggled to the bridge, blood dripping from a shoulder wound. "Sir, the turrets won't move. The hydraulic system has failed." An orderly came from the engine room, shouting, "The rudder mechanism no longer works, sir. The hydraulics have failed." I talked to both men at once. "What happened to Shimizu? How's the engine? Any fuel fires?" Lieutenant Shimizu was blasted from the ship, sir, leaving behind only one of his legs. "The engine works unimpaired, sir. The fuel has not caught fire." "All right, you gunner, go get first aid. Matsumoto, go to the engine room and check. Send reports to me every 3 minutes." The ship had come full circle on the ocean and was about to begin a second loop. Helena's shells were still raining around, but very few were now hitting. Near misses shook the ship violently. More fires were starting, but crewmen were active with water hoses. Our guns were still silent, and we had no torpedoes. If the enemy closed, we would be as defenceless as a bull in a slaughterhouse. Amatsukaze's movements were getting more erratic, and she started her second circle in dense smoke. The rain of shells diminished as the enemy ship at last began to move away. Good. He was not going to finish the job. An orderly came with Matsumoto's message. "The hydraulic system is definitely out. We'll have to operate the rudder with manpower. Please confirm." "All right. Tell him to halt the ship for the shift to manpower operation right away." Miyoshi winced and said, "Are we going to stop right here, sir? So near the enemy?" "Before we encounter more enemy ships," one of the voice pipes squawked. It was Matsumoto reporting. "Commander, we have patched some of the damage." "Good, Matsumoto. Stop the ship and shift the rudder for manpower operation." As the ship slowly shuddered to a halt, the enemy shelling stopped completely. Apparently, the enemy ship had turned around, thinking that Amatsukaze was done for. Through the dense smoke, I could no longer see the enemy ship. Actually, Helena was having its own troubles, more serious than mine. As it had caught me unaware, so it was caught unaware by 3 freshly arrived Japanese destroyers. The trio, Asagumo, Murasame and Samidare, originally had been in the vanguard arc formation with Yudachi and Harusame. Because of the drastic pre-battle maneuvers, they had fallen to the rear just before the battle started. They finally came on the scene barely in time to catch Helena. The enemy cruiser was battered helpless by 3 ships emerging from nowhere. Before it could determine who and where the new opponents were, Helena was defeated. Murasame's torpedoes delivered fatal blows, but the cruiser miraculously drifted a few more hours before sinking. Asagumo, Murasame's teammate, turned its guns toward another enemy ship approaching from the east. Destroyer Monson, her identification lamps lit, approached naively in the belief that the 3 prowling ships were friendly. Her lamps were suicidal, just as my searchlight had been when it attracted Helena. Several rapid salvos disabled Monson, and Asagumo finished her with torpedoes. Monson had been followed closely by Fletcher, who, in no mood to challenge the Japanese trio, turned tail and cleared out. Sterritt, one of the surviving enemy destroyers, claimed the sinking of a Japanese destroyer at this time and location with 2 torpedo hits, but there was no such Japanese destroyer. Akatsuki had sunk some time earlier, and Yudachi was still burning several miles to the west. It appears evident that Sterritt must have mistakenly sunk an American vessel. Her victim must have been one that was still barely adrift after absorbing a surfeit of Japanese torpedoes and shells. Some American versions say that Japanese guns fired on Japanese ships near the end of this battle. After checking with all my friends who took part in the battle, and after examining damage to the surviving Japanese destroyers, I can definitely state that this contention is unfounded. On the other hand, many of my friends say that the American ships exchanged gunfire among themselves in this battle. After Amatsukaze's helm and rudder were disengaged from the shattered hydraulic system, we resumed navigation. Luckily, the engines were in good order, and we quickly picked up a 20-knot speed. It is always difficult to handle the rudder of a 2,500-ton ship manually, and Amatsukaze had been badly battered. Her gears were twisted, and there were many gaping holes in the hull. The ship moved like a drunken man, skidding wildly from side to side. After a few painful minutes of watching this erratic movement, I knew what had to be done, and spoke into the tube. "Matsumoto, I'll take over. This manpower operation requires experience. Your timing is off. From now on, I'll give steering orders from up here and you pass them to your boys." 10 husky men dripped sweat handling the rudder. It was a back-breaking task, but my chore wasn't easy. I had to keep shouting almost steadily. My voice croaked and sweat streamed down my face. The veering movement continued, but the steering was less erratic. At 0300, Miyoshi reported that all fires were under control. A few minutes later, I saw Hiei to port. Her fires appeared to have subsided, but the flagship was almost at a standstill. There were no Japanese ships around to offer help. I felt sorry for my friends in the doomed ship, but my ship was in no shape to help anyone. The most I could do was to keep her going in a northerly direction. It was barely possible for us to negotiate the narrow waters of Indispensable Strait. Mustering all my strength and determination, I kept shouting directions into the voice tube, and we kept moving. At the first sign of daylight, Ensign Shoji shouted, "3 enemy planes approach." I ordered, "Miyoshi, take command of the guns. Do your best." The torpedo officer darted from the bridge. an orderly reported shortly. "No guns rotate, and only number 1 gun can be elevated skyward." That lone gun fired rapidly as the planes came close. They overestimated our speed and released their bombs too early. The nearest one fell some 300 meters off our bows. After one pass, the planes turned back toward Guadalcanal. More planes would probably follow, but brooding was of no use. We had work to do just keeping the ship moving forward, and we kept at it. Our luck seemed about to run out when Shoji next reported, "Commander, a ship sighted 9,000 meters ahead, speeding straight for us. What should we do, sir?" Instead of replying, I yelled into the pipe again, "Matsumoto, an undetermined ship is sighted ahead. Make your maximum speed. We can do nothing but ram if it is the enemy." Shoji dashed out to prepare the crew for this drastic action. I glanced again at the ship. It was closing on us at a speed of well over 30 knots. After a tense minute, I breathed a deep sigh of relief and called my orderly to summon Shoji quickly. "It's a Japanese destroyer. Yes, Yukikaze, unmistakably." Shoji came back leaping and bouncing with joy and relief. From a distance of 3,000 meters, a Yukikaze signalman started waving flags. They were distinct in the morning light. "Heartiest congratulations to Amatsukaze. We're heading to assist Hiei. Anything we can do for you?" My signalman immediately relayed my answer. "Thanks for your greetings. Don't bother about us. Go ahead full speed. Enemy planes already spotted us. Very probably Hiei too. Be prepared for air attack." "Good luck." We passed Yukikaze on our port beam at a distance of 1,000 meters. Crews on deck exchanged greetings. Though they had travelled a long way together in the meantime, this was the first time the two ships had seen each other since early the previous day. Yukikaze had been stationed immediately ahead of Amatsukaze in Abe's complex formation. We had not been visible to each other for the many hours of our blind march. In the battle, Yukikaze and cruiser Nagara were among the first to withdraw from the area. Yukikaze had not received a single hit. My warning to Yukikaze proved right. Scores of marine bombers swarmed over Hiei and demolished her. Admiral Abe ordered Hiei scuttled before abandoning ship as Yukikaze came alongside. It was this scuttling order which cost the jobs of Abe and Captain Masao Nishida, Hiei's skipper, a few days later. After passing Yukikaze, my ship slowed to its previous 20 knots. We were out of the hazardous strait and in a wide area. Our worries about shoals and reefs were over, but new worries cropped up. Daylight was unwelcome to a lone, crippled ship in an area infested by enemy submarines. The sonar equipment in Japanese destroyers, as explained earlier, was not of a high standard. Even when in working order, it was useless when a ship was running at 20 knots or better. Amatsukaze's sonar was completely dead at this time. "Matsumoto, you had better change your rudder detail every hour. We'll need real muscular strength to make any abrupt turns. Submarines may set on us at any moment." Strangely enough, for the next 12 hours there were no attacks. Enemy submarines must have seen Amatsukaze. Perhaps there was no attack because they did not realize that the lone wolf was limping. Amatsukaze was running at a steady 20 knots. Its skidding to left and right must have seemed like an intentional zigzag pattern. Had they come close, they would have seen how beaten up and crippled we were. About 1,500 another Japanese destroyer loomed on the horizon. Knowing we had reached safety, I suddenly felt exhausted. Accurate navigation had brought us to a spot about 250 miles north of Guadalcanal, where Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's fleet was standing by to sortie that night. As we closed in, I found destroyer Terutsuki, another companion of the Abe fleet. My signalman sent a message inquiring as to the general situation. A reply came quickly. "Welcome home, Amatsukaze. Our heartiest congratulations. You were reported lost hours ago. Few of us expected your return. Our fleet did well. Only Hiei and Udachi were reported dead in the water. Akatsuki has not been heard from and is considered lost. Murasame and Ikazuchi received shell hits, none vital. Again, congratulations. You worked a wonder. We are proud of you. As we approached Terutsuki, again most all of her crew moved to the railings and waved at us, calling, "Ataboy Amatsukaze!" Several other ships repeated the same kind of welcome for us, but I felt no triumph at all. My heart was heavy with remorse at my blunders. Amatsukaze was already inside the formation of Kurita's ships and was slowing down. His flagship, 27,500-ton battleship Kongo, emerged like a fortress. Her signalman was sending a flag message to us. "From Admiral Kurita to Commander Hara, I salute your brave return and am pleased to inform you I have orders for you to go along in my sortie. I shall be proud to have you with us. Acknowledge." I was astounded at this message and replied promptly, "From Commander Hara to Admiral Kurita, your compliments unwarranted. I return a cripple with loss of 43 crewmen, including gunnery officer. We are in need of repair. We are on manual steering now." A few minutes later, Kongo's message came. "Admiral Kurita orders you to return to Truk immediately. We repeat our respects to you all the same. Bon voyage and good luck. See you again." Kongo blurred through my tears as I read this warm message. I was choked up but managed to rasp into the voice tube, "Matsumoto, turn to starboard. We are going home." "Yes, sir," Matsumoto replied. "Say, Commander, you sound tired. Why don't you rest? You have been shouting continuously for the past 15 hours. I have learned enough of the rhythm and timing from your rudder directions to handle it now." "Thank you, Matsumoto. I guess you are right. You take over." I sat down for the first time in more than 24 hours. Minutes later, I sprang from the chair. I had forgotten something. "Miyoshi, Shoji, we must conduct funeral services before dark." 43 bodies, some mere token remains, were brought to the foredeck. Close friends of each of the deceased came forward, cleansed the bodies with hot fresh water and wrapped them in canvas. Precious distilled water was used freely for this ceremony. The wrapped and weighted bodies were dropped into the sea, while buglers sounded a farewell and the crew saluted. A sea burial is always sad. I had attended several such services, but never one so sad as this. When Miyoshi and Shoji consigned the first remains, a leg of Lieutenant Kazue Shimizu, the gunnery officer, to the sea, I wept. Shimizu, a headstrong man, had often argued with me, but he was a fine man and an excellent officer. If I had followed his recommendation and closed with Juno, perhaps I would not have committed the blunders which cost his life. 2 petty officers stepped forward to take care of the body of Warrant Officer Iwata, the man who, by sighting Helena, had once saved the ship and crew. I walked down from the bridge. The crew stared. It was the first time I had left the bridge since the start of this operation. "Iwata was my friend. I will take care of his remains." The 2 men gaped when I doffed my uniform jacket and put it over Iwata. "Iwata, farewell," I murmured. "Rest in peace." Tears flooded my eyes as I stood at attention and saluted. Trudging back to the bridge, I saw many crewmen weeping like children, several wiping their eyes with their fists. As I watched the setting of the big, fiery sun, I pledged never to repeat my mistakes. It was completely dark by the time the funeral services ended. Amatsukaze circled the burial area once while the crew offered prayers in a final farewell to their 43 buddies, and then continued to the north. Matsumoto, a young graduate of the Merchant Marine School, had learned the manual handling of the rudder very quickly. The ship advanced with a minimum of skidding, and 24 hours later, on November 14th, Amatsukaze anchored in Truk's quiet atoll. At Truk, I heard that Japanese submarine I-26 had just torpedoed and sunk a crippled United States cruiser near Guadalcanal. It was years later, however, that I learned that this was cruiser Juno, which Amatsukaze had hit and disabled. The battle ended unquestionably in a Japanese victory, but the win was purely tactical. Strategically, the enemy had won because the Abe force failed to deliver a single incendiary shell to Guadalcanal airfields. 9 American warships were sunk, but not in vain. They contributed greatly to the American side in the bitter contest for this island. Admiral Yamamoto at Truk was upset by the failure of Abe's mission. Hiei was the first Japanese battleship to be sunk in the war. Its scuttling infuriated Yamamoto, who had been quite lenient with earlier blunders committed by others of his men. The high command in Tokyo was also stung. The anger of the top admirals did not abate when they heard of Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's failure, immediately following that of Abe. A panel of admirals was established to conduct a secret court of inquiry. Abe and Captain Nishida, Hiei's skipper, were called to testify. They offered no defense of their actions or mistakes. The court's verdict was retirement for the 2 officers, almost the equivalent of the U.S. Navy's dishonorable discharge. They were allowed pensions, but were barred from public office. On the night of November 13th, Rear Admiral Shoji Nishimura's squadron of 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers closed the coast of Guadalcanal and shelled the airfields. The shelling was so ineffective that Marine planes rose from these airfields the next morning. They teamed with carrier Enterprise planes and swooped on a Japanese convoy of 11 transports, sinking or disabling 7 of them. The planes also sank cruiser Kinugasa and heavily damaged 3 destroyers. Admiral Kondo, Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, was ordered to replace Kurita as leader of the next sortie on the night of November 14th. 2 13,000-ton cruisers, Atago and Takao, under Kondo's direct command, were suddenly teamed with the original Abe fleet, less Hiei and 3 destroyers. Admiral Yamamoto's choice of Kondo proved to be a disastrous mistake. It is still a mystery to me why Yamamoto thought so highly of Kondo, even after his half-hearted actions in 2 earlier important battles. Kondo's 3 battleships, small cruiser, and 9 destroyers encountered a clearly inferior American force of 2 battleships and 4 destroyers, led by Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee. Despite his distinct numerical advantage, Kondo lost battleship Kirishima and a destroyer, while Lee lost only 3 destroyers. Kondo's 2 fast cruisers were still intact, but Kondo ordered their withdrawal without even trying to give chase to the American ships. It was his 3rd such half-hearted effort in 4 months. Admiral Yamamoto, who was stern with Abe, was strangely lenient with Kondo. Many of Kondo's officers were ashamed of him and of themselves. They preferred not to talk about the battle. Kondo was the British gentleman sort of man. He was amiable and affable to everyone and was known as a scholar. He was always good to me, and I had great respect for him. But I must say that it was one of Yamamoto's greatest errors that he so greatly overvalued Kondo's fighting ability. Kondo might have been a great commandant of the Naval Academy, but he was a misfit as commander of a naval fighting unit. At Truk Amatsukaze went alongside repair ship Akashi, whose chief engineer promptly came on board to inspect our damage. I acknowledged that our ship had been banged up a bit, but pointed out that she had made it back to port under her own steam, and concluded with my hope that Amatsukaze could be patched up without delay so that we might join the fleet again in a week or 10 days. The engineer smiled patiently and said, "Commander Hara, most skippers underestimate damage in their own ship, and, when engaged in battle, do things considered impossible in a normal voyage. Let's look around. I understand you fitted out this ship. Will you come along and explain her finer points?" Amatsukaze was indeed my baby. As her fitting-out officer, I had been at her launching early in 1940 and had spent the next 6 months supervising her every need. She was the finest destroyer of her day, this 2,500-ton fighting ship, and I knew every inch of her. The engineer and I spent a day going over her injuries. By the end of the tour, my optimism had fallen flat on its face. In her hull, we counted 32 holes larger than 1 metre in diameter. In addition, there were 5 smaller holes which had been bored by dud shells. After 40 small shrapnel holes, I stopped counting. That American cruiser had done a real job, which I had estimated as only 3 hits. The engineer was right. No longer a prize destroyer, a Matsukaze was but a floating wreck. At the end of the tour, we came to my cabin, where I flopped into a chair, depressed and morose. The engineer said understandingly, "Let me congratulate you on magnificent seamanship in bringing your ship back at all, let alone in such good time. You have really worked a miracle, but it cannot be repeated." I recognized the truth of his words, but was so dispirited that I had nothing to say. He continued, "As you must realize, we cannot concentrate all our efforts on your Amatsukaze. There are others that need repairs too. I estimate that it will take a month to patch up your ship enough to get back to Japan. Their precision parts will be available, and it should be possible to have Amatsukaze fully seaworthy in 1 month. But, I stammered, there is evidence that the enemy can effect major repairs in much less than 60 days. Why can't we? I knew that the answer lay in the enemy's tremendous industrial capacity, so far superior to Japan's, and realized how embarrassing my question was. An awkward silence followed until I spoke again. "Please do your best. I will stay with my ship. My men will cooperate with your repair crews in every possible way." The engineer expressed his appreciation, saluted, and withdrew. I was left to brood and again stroll the decks of my ship. Countless holes from machine gun bullets made me feel that we were lucky not to have lost more than 43 lives. Repairs were begun the following morning. For the next week, I was busy showing off my miracle ship to visitors from battleship Yamato and other ships anchored in the harbour of Truk. Without exception, they marvelled that a Matsukaze had survived. Many visitors congratulated me, but none asked my opinion of how to avoid such a fate in the future. I was more than ready with many recommendations, but no one asked. It puzzled me that not one of the staff officers from Combined Fleet who visited my battle-scarred ship was interested enough to ask me for opinions or recommendations. When this lack of curiosity continued throughout the week, I began to wonder about the ability of these men. It was disquieting to think that they, who were helping to form plans and strategy, were not interested in learning from recent battle experiences. Perhaps they were not as well qualified for their jobs as they should be. A most disturbing thought indeed. 2 letters from Japan reached me at Truk. In a letter written on November 13th, my wife told of conditions at home and concluded, "Little Mikito awakened suddenly last night and cried loud and long. I thought at first he was sick, but he finally explained that he had dreamed you were in danger. He said you looked pale and frightened. I wonder where you were last night and what you were doing. The newspapers tell of bitter battles in the south. I am worried about you." Noting the date, I recalled the night of November 12-13 and its dangers. I must have looked pale when we were being battered by the enemy cruiser, because I certainly was frightened. How could my little son have seen it? My mother, 82 years of age, had written the other letter. It concluded, "I pray each morning and night at the family altar that our ancestors and the merciful Buddha will protect you. Take care of yourself and come back alive." My eyes filled with tears at reading this. My thoughts turned to the families of my dead crewmen, and I wept aloud. Letters of condolence must be written to those 43 families before I could reply to my wife and mother. The sun was setting when I finished this sad task 8 hours later and walked out on deck. A motorboat approached a Matsukaze. Another curious spectator, but the courtesies must be observed. I approached the ramp as the boat came alongside. The passenger shouted a cheery greeting as he came up, and I recognized Commander Yasumi Toyama. He was Chief of Staff on Rear Admiral Razio Tanaka's Destroyer Squadron 2, based at Rabaul. I had previously belonged to this squadron, and we were old friends. He was in Truk for tactical conferences in Admiral Yamamoto's flagship Yamato. "You look sick," he said. "What is the matter? Were you hurt in battle?" "No, not a bit. I just feel let down. Anyone would after his ship had taken a beating like this. No, Hara, you should not feel bad. You did a terrific job. I had a good look at Amatsukaze from the motorboat. I knew you were the Navy's #1 torpedo officer, but never realized what a navigator you are. Any other skipper would have lost this ship. I can't agree, Toyama. We were just lucky that those countless enemy shells missed the engine and fuel tanks. Tell me, how is the squadron? Ah, he groaned. We are more a freighter convoy than a fighting squadron these days. The damn Yankees have dubbed us the Tokyo Express. We transport cargo to that cursed island, and our orders are to flee rather than fight. What a stupid thing. It is doubtful whether we could fight anyway. Our decks are stacked so high with supplies for Guadalcanal that our ammunition supply must be cut in half. Our cargo is loaded in drums which are roped together. We approach near the island, throw them overboard, and run away. The idea is that the strings of barrels will float until our troops on the island can tow them ashore. It is a strenuous and unsatisfying routine. But I want to hear about your battle and learn from your experience. Tell me all about it. That was the first intelligent request I had heard in a week. I explained with enthusiasm and in detail our latest operation, noting our failings and the enemies, and giving my fellow professional an overall analysis. In conclusion, I said, whatever our mission, we must always be ready for battle. I think it is wrong ever to consider fighting as merely secondary. Caution is necessary to be sure, but excessive caution is crippling. Please tell Admiral Tanaka not to repeat our mistakes. He left the ship to catch a plane back to Rabaul. His quick visit to Truk and his remarks about the curious supply activities of Destroyer Squadron 2 indicated that the enemy undoubtedly had air supremacy at Guadalcanal. Japanese destroyers were even having trouble acting as fast freighters. Supplies of every kind were acutely lacking for Japanese troops on the island. Their daily distress calls emphasized shortages of food and medication. Admiral Tanaka had been given responsibility for the stave-off starvation missions Toyama had described. In these operations, each destroyer would carry 100 or more drums of supplies in each nighttime delivery. Delivery consisted of jettisoning the strings of drums within 200 or 300 meters of the Guadalcanal coast. There, Army troops were supposed to boat, swim, or wade out to retrieve the precious containers and haul them ashore, where they would be manipulated into the jungle and hidden from enemy air attack. Tanaka's 8 destroyers left Rabaul November 27th and headed southward to the Shortlands. The passage had to be made furtively. In the darkness of the 29th, the squadron departed the Shortlands at 22:45 for the final leg of the mission. Taking every possible advantage, the force feinted eastward toward Roncador Reef and Ramos Island. Then, early in the morning of November 30th, the 8 destroyers, in single column, turned sharply south and headed straight for Guadalcanal. An enemy patrol plane made contact with the squadron at 800, and Admiral Tanaka realized that his secrecy of movement was broken. Soon afterward, an observation post on Guadalcanal reported a dozen enemy destroyers off Lunga Point. Messages from other posts soon confirmed this movement of an enemy surface force around the island. At 1500, Tanaka issued a directive to his squadron. It is probable that we will encounter an enemy force tonight. Although our primary mission is to land supplies, everyone is to be ready for combat. If an engagement occurs, take the initiative and destroy the enemy. The squadron reached the rendezvous point off Tassafaronga at 2100, and speed was slowed to 12 knots. A northeasterly breeze yielded a visibility of 9,000 meters. Tanaka's ships approached in single-column formation with Takanami as scout, 3,000 meters in the lead and slightly on the port bow of flagship Naganami. This was a flexible deployment for destroyers, far more advantageous than the overcautious double-ring formation used by Admiral Abe on the night of November 12-13. The American force, which came to challenge Tanaka under Rear Admiral Carlton H. Wright, repeated the formation used by Callahan and Scott. They too were in single column, 4 destroyers in the van, 5 cruisers, then 2 rear destroyers, the whole led by destroyer Fletcher with its modern radar equipment. 2 weeks earlier, Fletcher had survived the Callahan-Scott debacle from its position at the tail of the formation. When the action opened, the US side had a distinct advantage of numbers. Besides numerical inferiority, Tanaka was further handicapped in that the decks of his ships were stacked high with drums of supplies. Because of these cargoes, the ammunition supply in each ship had to be reduced by 1/2. In addition to the reduction of shells for their guns, each of Tanaka's destroyers carried only 8 torpedoes instead of their full quota of 16. Admiral Wright's squadron had left Espiritu Santo early in the morning specifically to intercept Tanaka's destroyers, which had been spotted by scout plane. At 21:06, flagship Minneapolis's radar first detected the Japanese force at 26,000 yards. 10 minutes later, radar screens in Fletcher caught a target 7,000 yards on the port bow, and the destroyer prepared to launch torpedoes. But 5 precious minutes were wasted before Fletcher, as well as destroyers Perkins and Drayton, were given permission to fire torpedoes. A total of 20 fish sped toward Japanese targets. None hit. Meanwhile, Admiral Tanaka was busy studying charts and the position of his ships. His cargo dumping point was only 5,000 meters distant at 21:15 when scout ship Takanami reported. Enemy ships bearing 100 degrees, identified as 3 destroyers. Takanami immediately launched 8 torpedoes at these targets and opened fire with her guns. This was done on Takanami's own initiative without waiting for permission to open fire. Until the 5 US cruisers opened fire at this time, Tanaka had been unaware of their presence. Instantly, Tanaka ordered, "Belay supply schedule. All ships prepare to fight." 1 minute later, at 21:22, Tanaka further ordered, "All ships, full battle speed." American gunners seemed to have aimed at only Takanami. She, at any rate, was the only Japanese ship hit. Many direct hits set her furiously afire, and she sank with all of her 211 crewmen. With flaming Takanami as a shield, Tanaka made a daring 180-degree turn to bring his ships on a course parallel to the enemy column. He then sped up to close with the enemy ships, and Naganami swung to port after firing a spread of 8 torpedoes at the leading cruiser Minneapolis. The 6 other Japanese destroyers promptly followed Naganami's example. These broadside launchings had far more precision than those of Fletcher and her companions, who fired at targets approaching head-on. It was no wonder or surprise that the American torpedoes missed. They had been fired at an almost impossible angle, apparently without proper calculation of the many factors involved. The consequent poor marksmanship reflected a lack of training in torpedo technique. 2 of Naganami's torpedoes, on the other hand, hit Minneapolis, shattering her bow, exploding a fire room, and slowing the lead cruiser almost to a stop. New Orleans, next in line, narrowly avoided colliding with the flagship when a torpedo, apparently from Makinami, caught her port bow and exploded 2 forward magazines. The blast knocked off the cruiser's bow clear back to the number 2 turret. Cruiser Pensacola, next in line, also fared badly. While trying desperately to avoid a collision, she took a torpedo hit which ignited fuel tanks, turning her into a floating torch. It was 12 hours before the flames were conquered, and the crew knew that they could save her. Light cruiser Honolulu followed Pensacola until that ship turned to port when the torpedoes began hitting. At that time, Honolulu swerved to starboard to avert colliding and thus got out of the glare shed by her burning colleagues. She zigzagged away to the northwest and escaped being hit even by gunfire. Northampton, the last cruiser of the enemy formation, could have seen little of the activity until she was upon her 3 flaming colleagues. She started to follow Honolulu, but, seeing the Japanese ships dashing to the west, turned westward herself and opened fire with 8-inch guns. Hers was a hasty blind shelling which scored no hits. But 2 Japanese torpedoes caught her port side, causing a monstrous explosion which swept her with flames and left Northampton to sink. Tanaka's squadron swung northwest at full speed as soon as its torpedoes were launched, leaving behind a badly battered and confused enemy. Honolulu, the only undamaged cruiser of the American force, mistook rearguard destroyers Lamson and Lardner for Japanese targets and blazed away at them until they turned and fled. The action had lasted about 15 minutes. Flagship Naganami slowed down some 50 miles away from Guadalcanal, and Admiral Tanaka took account of his forces. Not one of his surviving 7 destroyers had been hit by a single shell or torpedo, nor had they lost a man of their crews. It was a remarkable performance to have inflicted so much damage on the enemy at a cost of only 1 destroyer. But Admiral Tanaka was not jubilant. He grieved over the loss of Takanami, and was glumly silent during the withdrawal while he considered returning to the battle zone to rescue survivors and re-engage the enemy. A tally showed that 4 of his 7 ships had spent all their torpedoes, 1 had fired only half of its supply, and the 2 others had fired none because of a bad angle during their firing run. A total of 44 torpedoes had thus been expended. In light of this, Tanaka decided that his force was no longer in shape to engage the enemy. Accordingly, at 2330, he gave the order to return to Rabaul. The High Command took a dim view of this decision, even though Tanaka claimed to have sunk a battleship and 2 cruisers, and to have damaged 4 other cruisers. The facts were impressive enough, for Tanaka had sunk 1 and seriously damaged 3 heavy cruisers, at a cost of only 1 destroyer. But these statistics were not as persuasive with Tanaka's superiors as the fact that he had failed to unload the cargo so badly needed on Guadalcanal. The Navy's displeasure with Tanaka was reflected in his transfer to Singapore shortly after this battle, and then to Burma. These transfers, which took him away from the active fighting front, where his ability was so desperately needed, undoubtedly saved his life. Who knows what the Navy's short-sighted retributive policy may have cost in subsequent losses, which Tanaka might have prevented. Throughout the war, Tanaka never again held a responsible command afloat. 15 years after the Battle of Tassafaronga, I visited him at his farm near Yamaguchi. In discussing the action, he told me, "I have heard that US naval experts praised my command in that action. I am not deserving of such honours. It was the superb proficiency and devotion of the men who served me that produced the tactical victory for us. In this, I am not rejecting glory in order to escape criticism. I accept the principal criticism levelled by fellow officers. It was an error on my part not to deliver the supplies according to schedule. I should have returned to do so. The delivery mission was abandoned simply because we did not have accurate information about the strength of the enemy force. I believed that the enemy formation had 4 van destroyers and 4 more following the cruisers, as in the Callahan-Scott formation of 2 weeks earlier. I saw no percentage in having our 7 destroyers, low on ammunition and decks loaded with cargo drums, fight another running battle against 8 US destroyers. Had I but known that only 1 cruiser and 4 destroyers remained in fighting trim." Tears came to his eyes when he spoke of destroyer Takanami. "We were able to defeat Admiral Wright's ships in this action only because of Takanami. She absorbed all the punishment of the enemy in the opening moments of battle, and she shielded the rest of us. Yet we left the scene without doing anything for her or her valiant crew." However, Admiral Tanaka may have felt about the Japanese effort at Tassafaronga. It is fair to consider what the US naval historian Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison had to say about this battle. "It is always some consolation to reflect that the enemy who defeats you is really good, and Rear Admiral Tanaka was better than that. He was superb. Without his trusted flagship Jintsu, his decks cluttered with supplies, he sank a heavy cruiser and put 3 others out of action for nearly a year, at the cost of 1 destroyer. In many actions of the war, mistakes on the American side were cancelled by those of the enemy. But despite the brief confusion of his destroyers, Tanaka made no mistakes at Tassafaronga. Before Admiral Tanaka's transfer to Singapore, there was time for him to lead several more transport missions to Guadalcanal. On December 3, he commanded a force of 4 cruisers and 11 destroyers, which succeeded in delivering 1,500 drums of supplies to the shores of Guadalcanal. Tanaka was ready for a repetition of the Tassafaronga action, but the Americans apparently were not. Tanaka's phenomenal win had staggered the US Navy. There was no surface opposition, but some planes harassed the force and dropped a few bombs which slightly damaged one destroyer. It was a sour note in the operations that only 500 of the drums were picked up by the island forces. 4 nights later, Tanaka was back again, this time with just 11 destroyers. Excessive repetition of a single formula in warfare is almost bound to fail, and this time planes from Henderson Field damaged 2 of his destroyers. On this night too, Tanaka was confronted for the first time by a new kind of opponent, motor torpedo boats. 8 of these swift little PTs so harried his force that the reinforcement effort was called off and the destroyers returned to base. Tanaka tried again on the night of December 11th, using 9 destroyers, and succeeded in dropping 1,200 drums of supplies. Air attacks on this convoy were ineffective, but the PTs struck again and hit flagship Teruzuki with 2 torpedoes which set her aflame. Her crew tried valiantly to save her, but all efforts proved futile when the fires exploded her depth-charge stowage. Tanaka was injured when the torpedoes hit Teruzuki, but he transferred his flag and got home. In addition to the loss of his flagship, Tanaka was grieved by news that of the 1,200 drums transported and dropped on this run, only 220 reached Japanese hands. Admiral Tanaka was hospitalized at Rabaul, and there he dictated a memorandum to the High Command recommending the withdrawal of forces from Guadalcanal. In reply, he received orders assigning him to Singapore. This flat rejection of Tanaka's recommendation was unfortunate, since it was becoming apparent that the island was no longer tenable. Submarines, as well as destroyers, were being used to bring in supplies, yet their combined best efforts brought only a trickle of what was needed to support the 20,000 troops. Through these exciting days, I remained at Truk. I felt sorry for Tanaka, but could do nothing to help him. There was no new destroyer available for me, so I could only watch as the skilled hands from repair ship Akashi worked over the scores of holes which cruiser Helena's armour-piercing shells had put in my destroyer. Amatsukaze was patched enough that I was able to leave Truk on December 15th for the homeland where precision repairs could be made. The 5-day voyage was uneventful. As we passed the island of Saipan, I saw a dozen Japanese planes and was curious about how they would react to our appearance. I was disappointed when not one of them even bothered to determine our identity. This nonchalance, if such it was, bespoke a laxity which was unwarranted and unforgivable while Japanese were being bled white in the Solomons. I was almost able to forget the war, however, when we entered our home port of Kura. Seagulls crisscrossed our bows in graceful greeting as we enjoyed the quiet of this peaceful and familiar harbour. It was so different from the savage waters of the Solomons. Could it be that such contrasting places belonged to the same world? When Amatsukaze was safely docked and arrangements were made for her thorough inspection and repair, I was able to take a week of home leave. I arrived at my home in Kamakura on December 27th. The week passed all too quickly, but it was a delight for me to be able to spend even that much time with my family. Kamakura is one of the most beautiful cities of Japan, and I enjoyed revisiting its scenic places with my children and hiking through the city and its surrounding hills. Pine trees hummed their eternal song to the balmy Pacific breezes. It was almost too good to be true. I felt especially lucky to be at home for the New Year holiday. Despite the pleasure of being home, there really was no forgetting the war. One day we had planned a picnic, but my wife was unable to go with us. She had to attend a meeting of neighbourhood wives to discuss household brass and iron collections for the use of the military. Later that same evening, I had a Tokyo phone call from my old friend Commander Ko Nagasawa, who was working in the Personnel Bureau. He said, "This is an unofficial call, so don't get flustered. A group of our classmates are getting together tomorrow night for a Bonenkai, New Year's party. We have chosen Yokohama's Isogo-en as the meeting place. It is a good restaurant, just about halfway between Tokyo and Yokosuka. It is near your home, so we are counting on your being there. I arrived the next evening at the appointed hour of 7 to be greeted by Nagasawa and Commander Enpei Kanuka, who was Naval Liaison Assistant to Premier General Hideki Tojo. I was surprised to see that Kanuka had been able to get this far away from his busy and important office to attend an unofficial party. Seated next to him in our reserved room, I said, "You must have had a hell of a time in your job recently with all the troubles we've been having down south." "No, Hara, not at all," he replied glumly. "As a matter of fact, for the past 5 months, General Tojo has asked me for no advice, no briefing, no business, nothing at all. The General seems to have no interest whatsoever in naval operations. My only duty in this time has been to attend nightly cocktail parties for VIPs. I don't like to drink, I'm bored to death, and the routine is killing me. With your capacity for alcohol, Hara, maybe you should replace me." Ordinarily soft-spoken Kanuka had raised his voice quite noticeably during this harangue, and grim-faced Nagasawa of the Personnel Bureau had listened in silence. A short time later, Kanuka was ordered out of Tokyo to take command of cruiser Nachi. Nagasawa had evidently taken him seriously. Otherwise, everything was quiet and sedate, unlike the riotous parties of our younger days. About 20 of us were gathered that evening, commanders and lieutenant commanders, and the talk was concerned almost entirely with the war. When asked to describe the situation in the Solomons, I was happy to oblige. I don't know how you who are stationed here view things from the homeland, but it is hell at the front. As professionals, you all know better than to base your judgments on the official bravado announced by headquarters in Tokyo. We have had some tactical victories, but we are suffering a strategic defeat. Our destroyers and submarines in the Solomons are now being used as transports, and ineffective ones at that. The entire party was listening as I described actions I had seen. There was interest in my candid account, but someone reminded us that this was a party and we should stop talking shop. A few jokes and wisecracks were exchanged, and someone told about an affair with a geisha girl in Sasebo. But there was no real mood for merriment. We all knew our dismal prospects for the future. I truly wanted to let them know what we had experienced in the South, what my own reactions were, and my opinions. I knew that a party was no proper place for such topics, and yet there was no other chance. And it was disappointing to see the world weariness of my classmates. There was much drinking, but little sign of drunkenness when the party broke up at a fairly early hour. Farewells, outside in the cold, starlit night, were spiritless mutterings. "See you again." This was said without conviction. Very few of that group survived the war. Tojo might ignore his naval liaison officer, but there was no ignoring the formal representations of the Naval High Command. The ranking officers of the Army and Navy were huddling daily in secret strategy conferences at Tokyo. The last of a series of these conferences took place on December 31st in the Imperial Palace, attended by Emperor Hirohito. The conference decided unanimously for the withdrawal of troops from Guadalcanal. The rest of the holiday with my family passed happily but too quickly, and I returned to Kure on January 7th. 3 days later, I got orders relieving me from command of Amatsukaze and assigning me to duty at the Yokosuka Naval Station. This was only a few miles from my home. Within a week of my departure, I was again settled comfortably at home, and then I fell ill. The doctor said it was exhaustion resulting from extended rigorous duty at sea. I was confined to bed for 2 weeks. Adding to my misery, further orders came on the 25th, naming me commander of Destroyer Division 19, with instructions to take its 4 modern ships to sea 2 days later. I phoned Nagasawa to report my inability to accept the post. Understanding and comforting as only a good friend can be, he assured me that there would be other such posts available when I recovered. My convalescence seemed terribly long. I had never felt fatigue in battle. At sea, a few hours' sleep would always refresh me. Now, suddenly, I was aware of how exhausting my sea duty had been, and realised why Admiral Nagumo had looked so worn in November when I saw him at Truk. As my strength returned, I took long walks. The hills and the beaches were beautiful. In the woods, I gathered pine cones each day and carried them home for fuel. They burned well enough to be used for cooking, and that helped. But it was depressing to realise how scarce all basic commodities were. By the end of February, I was fully recovered and called Nagasawa to ask about my next assignment.